The Brooklyn Nets pull off a comeback that they never should have had to execute against the Portland Trailblazers on Friday night, with the Utah Jazz ahead and the continued pressure of pushing towards the playoffs. We break down the concerns coming out of that game and whether or not we can just wipe them away by the wayside. All coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Bet Online. Bet Online has you covered all season long with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, it's where the game starts. And where we start is on a Friday night against the Portland Trailblazers, a game that the Brooklyn Nets, coming off the gut punch loss to the Dallas Mavericks, had to have, and yet tried their damnedest to put themselves in a real hole, a deeper hole than they've already got themselves into here from, doing of their own against lesser competition earlier in the season. And then obviously injuries. And we know the absence of Kyrie Irving in home games. But coming into this one and really coming into these three games, we talked about Dallas, Portland, and then Utah before you're going to get some road games with Kyrie back on the court, starting with Memphis. How you had to get 2 out of 3. And when you lose that difficult matchup there against Dallas, the dagger from Spencer Dinwiddie, you say, all right, it ratchets up what we need to get done here, but go out, take care of Portland and not look past them. Take care of Portland, bury them early, take care of the game, and then turn your attention to the Utah Jazz. And even though there's some things in this one, especially even early on, there's a lot of stuff that we can get into, positives just from an execution standpoint, from a player performance standpoint, and yet as a team, it was not good enough in that game to start. This was one where the Nets had their 8th straight game of 30-plus points in the first quarter. But as we know, when you do not have all of your firepower, no Kyrie Irving, no LaMarcus Aldridge still in this one, you have to be able to pivot and say, let's hang our hat defensively here against one of the worst offensive teams in the league, by the way. And let's clamp down, get ourselves an early lead, and not put it into cruise mode, but just let the Portland Trailblazers know, as we've said about a lot of these teams around the NBA that don't have a lot to play for late in the season, while you may be able to play carefree basketball, while the Brooklyn Nets may have a target on their back from every single team in the East or otherwise, you are not going to compete against us tonight. The Nets simply didn't do it on Friday. They played good offensive basketball. Portland did some things defensively, nothing shocking from the standpoint of what to expect when you only have Kevin Durant out there on the floor. But you have to be better than what we got from them to start this game. We'll talk about, again, some specific players here in a minute. But when you look at this score line, 75 points is really the big one in the first half of this one. 33 points given up. You outscored them 34-33 in the first quarter. But again, this is not a fire. This is not Dame Lillard's Portland Trailblazers. You gave up 33 points in the first quarter, 42 in the second quarter, and 75 points in the first half. I mean, it's tricky because we say don't overreact or underreact to a given game, right? Don't make a big deal about losing one. Don't overinflate the value of one win. We got pretty excited about the 76ers game, certainly. But by and large, let's keep an even keel here. We know what the long-term goal is. We're going to get into the standings and how tricky it's going to be here when you take a look at how far back they are from Toronto and Cleveland and how they've played out their last few games as well. But you just don't want to feel like when you look at the remaining schedule and you kind of want to just check off some wins here along the way, that you may find yourself in a circumstance where you were down 18 points in this game and had to put on a bit of a comeback. Now, I was over in Spaces. Shout out to Saint from Nets Kingdom over in Spaces on Twitter at halftime. I said, I think they're going to get there. I think they're going to bring this one back. Call for 10-point win. Didn't quite finish that off, though. If Seth Curry knocked down a couple of late triples, it would have been a different story. But I thought they could come back because they're the better team, right? When you have Kevin Durant on the court, you're the better team. You need to go and win. You need to be able to go and dominate. And they did that in the second half. They held the Portland Trailblazers to just 48 points in the third and fourth quarter combined, just 22 points in the fourth. They came out in the third quarter, 39-point a quarter there to really get themselves back into it and then finish the job over the course of the fourth quarter. But it was just upsetting, concerning, I guess, is probably just concerning that at this stage of the season, knowing all the circumstances that you're dealing with, which are not surprising coming into this game, that you still found yourself looking, I put it, lackadaisical, looking like you're still disengaged. And I'll point to, and Kevin Durant, we're going to get into his individual performance and how strong it was. But early in this game, in the first half, he had sloppy turnovers and lazy turnovers, careless possessions where he just simply was not making a crisp pass. Some people said on Twitter, that Portland was being more physical in the game. And listen, I think that, the game by nature is physical, and I know what they mean. They're bigger. When you look inside the box score on Portland's side of things and you start to say Justice Winslow, you have him having a game, Eubanks having a game, they combined for 15 of 25, gave you plus 30 there, 33 points together. I understand that you were getting quote unquote beaten up on the interior, but it wasn't a physicality. To me, it was again a lackadaisical nature from the Brooklyn Nets. You weren't locked in. When you're the better team, the underdog being scrappy or trying to be physical, trying to establish themselves in the low block, it shouldn't matter because you're the better, more talented team and you should be able to outperform them. Andre Drummond should be able to go toe to toe with anybody on the interior for the Portland Trailblazers in this game and put on a bit of a show. Finished with 9 rebounds. We're not going to cover everybody in this game, right? Offensively, you did your job in the first quarter. Defensively, you didn't get it done. You got to be in the hip pocket of your man. We talked about it the last game. Defense, and everybody knows, defense is not about ability, it's about effort. And if you're not going to put in the effort on the defensive end to start a game against a bad team in the Portland Trailblazers, then you're going to end up coming out of the first quarter only leading by 1. You're going to give a team a little bit of confidence. And before you know it, you're going to turn around and you're going to see yourself struggling to find your defensive rhythm, struggling to beat the pressure that they're putting on you for stretches on the defensive side of the ball, and you're going to find yourself down big. Now, again, you came back in it and you got the win. So it's, can you push this by the wayside? Yes. Will we remember this game, especially because they won, by the time we get to the final game of the season and we're going to the playoffs? No, we won't, because there's been a lot of games like this over the course of the year against lesser competition that, by the way, the Brooklyn Nets lost a lot of those games. And we're not going to think about those once it comes time for this playoff push. But in the moment, it was about as deflating as you could, as you could get when it comes to the Brooklyn Nets, knowing what's on the line. And by the way, there's probably I don't want to say emotional, but there's a mental strain here, I think, on a game-to-game basis for Brooklyn. As good as a lot of guys are playing, it's understood. Every time that we step out here down the stretch, we need to be winning these games. We don't have any room for error. And I maybe would lend some credence to that if it looked like guys were playing tight. But again, they weren't. The offense was flowing. Everything looked free. You just were not doing the job on the other end of the court. And for whatever the cause of it was, they got through it. They got across the line. And we'll get into some of the key pieces here. We'll talk about Kevin Durant's game, obviously. Going to highlight what the backcourt for Portland did in this game. But then the importance of a couple players. Bruce Brown continues to have his hot streak. Just had that conversation on last week's episode about where does he rank in the hierarchy of important players on the Brooklyn Nets roster. But before we do, of course, got to tell you about our friends over at Built Bar. That's because if you're looking to be healthy, looking to get yourself in shape and stay in shape, you don't want to be reaching for any of those nasty candy bars, any of those junk food items. No, get yourself a Built Bar. And that's because they're great tasting and also great for you, covered in 100% real chocolate. You go to those stat lines, as we like to say, just 130 calories, only 4 grams of sugar, just 4 grams of net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Mention the candy bars with 240 calories and 30 grams of sugar. Why even bother with it? You can even get over and try the new, one of a kind, first of its kind, I should say, protein infused marshmallow bars. They call them the puffs. They're delicious, also covered in 100% real chocolate. And when you get over to built.com, you can try out mint brownie, coconut almond. New all month long is the white chocolate cookies and cream. They're all delicious and new flavors are coming all the time. If you can think of a flavor that might be good, Built Bar has probably made it. And it'll be delicious and good for you over on built.com. So, if we talk about the importance of a returning player here in Seth Curry, who in the pregame and then in the postgame remarked potentially this is something that he was dealing with going back to Philadelphia pre-trade. It got aggravated a little bit, and it took him a couple games away. And he said, as long as it doesn't get any worse, I can manage it and I can navigate the remainder of the season into the playoffs. Listen, it sounds like he's going to be okay, but I wouldn't exactly call that a glowing endorsement around his ankle. He was obviously huge in this game. Even in the beginning when things weren't going so well from a defensive perspective, the value that he brings, obviously, when you talk about what Portland and what a lot of teams are doing, those blitzing defenses, throwing the second man at Kevin Durant, trying to get the ball out of his hands and in Kevin Durant for all that he struggled with, I'll say, from the turnover perspective, because eight turnovers. You can't be Kevin Durant with 11 games, 12 games to go in the season, committing 8 turnovers in a single game. He struggled in that department. Now, the fact that he went 11 of 15 from the field and 14 of 15 from the line in 38 minutes and gave you a 38-point performance, without which you obviously would not have won this game, you're going to give him a little bit of wiggle room there. But again, this was the start of this game was a little bit rough, the first half of this game. 6 assists in this one, though. The counterbalance to what Portland's trying to do is outletting the ball and trusting the players around you. And in that, you have to look at Seth Curry, who gave you 9 of 14 and 7 of 11 from beyond the arc. I think tying his career high in 3-point percentage. He is now third all time currently in this moment in 3-point shooting percentage, narrowly ahead of the injured Joe Harris for the Brooklyn Nets. And it was a plus 15 over his 38 minutes. Only player in double digits plus minus. Kevin Durant was the net neutral in this game. So obviously Seth Curry is a better player than Kevin Durant. as Doug likes to say, when the plus minus works in our favor, we'll use it. It was obviously a really important game from him, and it showed you how, especially in the absence of Kyrie Irving, the perimeter shooting, guys that can knock these looks down, it's absolutely critical for Brooklyn if you're going to have success going forward. And Seth Curry has been now, I think he's averaging just under 18 points a game since coming over in the trade, but 27 in this one. He has multiple 20-plus point games since coming over to Brooklyn. He's been consistent, elite from the perimeter. And the fact that he can do it at all 3 levels, as we've said before, is pretty important, let alone the facilitation aspect of his game. Early on in this one, he showed obviously knocking down the outside shot. He also showed a nice connection with Nicholas Claxton, who we'll get into here in a second as well on a lob. A couple of different plays there where the threat of his 3-point shooting and the consistency at which he's been able to knock it down really affords him the ability to also put the ball on the deck and attack in the mid-range game and also look to facilitate and get some other easy opportunities for those around him because we always talk about the gravity of superstars. Kevin Durant has a gravity that pulls the defense towards him and opens things up. Seth Curry is not on that level of gravity, but he does have that aspect to his game to whatever degree you want to put it to. Because when he gets that ball out on the wing or anywhere on the perimeter, the defense, if you catch them in a rotation, if you're working the ball and they're trying to effectively get their switches or work underneath high screens, all of a sudden a switching defense, yeah, you're going to get a couple of bodies gravitating towards Seth Curry and freeing something else up. Hopefully, you want it to be back in the hands of Kevin Durant, but we saw in this one using the bigs, using a Nicholas Claxton and saying, using a Bruce Brown, easy buckets for you, easy looks for you are going to come because I'm commanding the attention of the defense here. We said about these recent games. Obviously, he had some more quiet performances that can be impacted by the return of Kyrie Irving when the games are obviously on the road, like in Charlotte, like in Boston, 9 and 8 points respectively in those. And I think we said it back then, and we'll continue to say it now, even in those games when Kyrie is there, and if he's going to go off for 60-point performances, you live with it. But you want to make sure that you're utilizing and maximizing the value of a player like Seth Curry. They did that in this game. He was obviously huge for them and a big factor in the second half in that third quarter, getting the Nets back in front and ultimately getting them the win. Off of him, and we'll stick it kind of in the old facilitation role here. Goran Dragic, again, early on, and the thing that's easy to maybe look past in this game because they were losing by the break and giving up 75 points, specifically on the offensive end, though. When you go and look at Goran Dragic's game, I really thought no look passes early in this one, knocked down a couple of shots. We keep saying this now, ever since the trade, the difference between this team and specifically about how you handle blitzing defenses and some of the looks that you're going to get from teams when they see just Kevin Durant out there from a superstar standpoint. The passing is there now. We've even mentioned it with Andre Drummond at the 5, right? He's obviously the best passer that they have at that position since the trade. Seth Curry, Goran Dragic are the best passers after Kyrie Irving, after Kevin Durant. They're the next guys up. These guys did not exist on the roster, and no one that left, excluding James Harden, but nobody that left, speaking to the idea of, Bembry or maybe a Paul Millsap, but these guys have elevated the ability to when you have 5 players on the court, you're now talking about having 2 or 3 at all times, high level passers that see the court, that understand the game, and that are playing with a high basketball IQ. The old, you know, what do you lose without James Harden? A ton. But what can you gain in the pieces you bring back? It's balance. It's balance and consistency. And they were able to do that. And Dragic's line, I want to get in on it here real quick. The 3 steals, the 10 assists. That's really where your mind goes here. And I thought he actually did a nice job. By the way, Dragic, when we talk about the hierarchy of rotations here and Patty Mills, and we said he's going to get hunted on these switches, Dragic is at least a little bit longer in the backcourt for them. So he can be a little bit more effective in some of these defensive assignments. This isn't a good example for anybody on the defensive assignments. But again, the 10 assists in this game gave you 9 points, 3 of 7 from the field. That's what you want him to be. You want to be able to, when Kyrie Irving is on the court for this team, say, Dragic, man, if you can step in here, get out onto the wings, knock down some of the 3-point opportunities because you're going to fall into that role a little bit more when you have KD and Kyrie out there on the court. But then when you're in between, when you're stemming the tide from first unit to second unit, you have got to be picking out the shooters on the perimeter. You've got to be finding the bigs underneath the basket, and you have to be punishing the defense for not staying at home on their assignments and getting caught too much worrying about Kevin Durant. And that ultimately was the big theme about this game and getting back into it, was the ability of this team to say, we need to punish them when they're going to try to force the ball out of Kevin Durant's hands. The other guy then that we want to touch on quickly here is, of course, someone that I'm curious to see what his role is going to look like. And we'll get to it in just one second here, because first let's talk about our friends over at Bet Online. Said it at the top of the show. You know that it's that time of year, man. March Madness is well underway. Upset specials all across the board. Who had Kentucky going out? First round. Could have made a couple of bucks potentially. And that's why you get over to Bet Online, where they have all the odds, contests, and player props. BetOnline.net is the #1 source for all your sports betting needs and info. They remain your best spot for sports scores, podcast, and news this season. And it's not just basketball, friends. As you know, BetOnline is also your continued source for all your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. You head over to the website or use your mobile device to learn more about all the trends in action. Bet Online it's where the game starts. And the thing that I wanted to kind of just start considering before we get into just the schedule ahead here, and maybe the reality of what's going to happen down the final 11 games for Brooklyn. But Nicholas Claxton now is not, I was going to say quietly, it's not quiet. We're all noticing it because that's what Nicholas Claxton is. He's a guy that you are excited to start the season and then misses a bunch of games. He's a guy that comes back and looks electric and then misses some games. He's a guy that comes back and kind of looks like he doesn't know what he's doing anymore and then misses some games. Now, while he's back on the court, he's been phenomenal. And we know with the speculation that we're not going to do on when Ben Simmons will officially get on the court, that Nicholas Claxton in his defensive role obviously can fill that gap for Brooklyn here. And listen, in this one, I said I wanted to see some more of him earlier on in the game when they weren't able to get defensive stops. He came in. He had some plays here, especially in the second half as well. He wasn't terribly effective defensively against Portland. And you can chalk it up as just one of those games. But over 25 minutes where he went 3 of 5, he gave you the 9 rebounds, came away with the 2 blocks, obviously, and 7 points. This is, listen, you'd like to see him in double digits to really feel like he's making an impact. But my curiosity now is, though, you have LaMarcus Aldridge dealing with the hip impingement. We don't know what his timeline to return is going to be. And even when he does, the Ben Simmons component is going to change a lot of roles for people on this team, and minute shares are going to look a little bit different. But can Nicholas Claxton still be the athletic, get out, run the floor, do some things defensively for you, pick up some switches in between Ben Simmons' minutes on the floor, especially if we think about right now that Ben Simmons, could maybe come back during the regular season. He may show up in the playing game. He may show up in the first round of the playoffs. So at that point, we're still going to be talking about the favorite term for the NBA, ramp up. Ramping up Ben Simmons so that he's going to be available to whatever capacity is available. I mean, it obviously is still very much a question mark. So Nicholas Claxton right now, playing the way he has over these last handful of games, knowing what Aldrich is dealing with, he's going to have a role here, at least for the remaining 11 games. At a minimum, he's going to have a role over that stretch. Now, the question becomes, and we said this before, when you get Ben Simmons on the court, then where's the defensive value necessarily in terms of what you need to utilize? Could you bring him in for a couple of key possessions late in games when it comes to the playoffs? Yes. But is this going to be where Steve Nash looks at the roster and says, if I can get LaMarcus Aldridge back and healthy, now we're talking about more offensive firepower, king of the mid range. We want to pour it on you early and often and make it so that you don't feel like you can climb out of that hole. But even then, I think the second wave of let's bury them early and then let's punish them late and allow Nicholas Claxton to come in, obviously be a very switchable component on the defensive end. Let him have his calling card. Let him hang his hat on a couple of blocks a game, on a few key defensive switches where he picks up a guard and stays in front of him and follows him to the rim and disrupts the passing lanes. Like, if you can carve out 15 to 20 minutes for him where that's his sole focus, and then you take anything you get, which, by the way, had another offensive rebound putback, I think on a Bruce Brown miss that he's been doing with consistency, came late in this game that really helped put it away, right? He seems to be growing into a comfort level around showing up in some of the big moments and understanding that there is a pressure there that he should not be feeling because he is good enough, he is talented enough to get the job done. Did it in this game. Does LaMarcus Aldridge have the ups to elevate, reach back, and grab that offensive rebound and throw it back down? No. Does LaMarcus Aldridge have the ability to give you 15 to 20 points in a game and not have to worry about that late? Yes. So it's just fascinating to see the road that Nicholas Claxton has been on and how the Brooklyn Nets could utilize him, utilize Andre Drummond, utilize LaMarcus Aldridge as he comes back. And then, even though I know we're talking about in this weird positionless basketball kind of way, and then when you put Ben Simmons in the mix, obviously with his height, with his length, and with his defensive functionality, it's just going to be interesting to see what these rotations look like and whether or not, unlike in what would be typical championship caliber teams, Will the Brooklyn Nets be a slightly deeper rotation come playoffs than you would typically see? I think obviously, you're going to look at it and say Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and Ben Simmons if he can be there, and Seth Curry, and then you're talking about Goran Dragic, and where does Bruce Brown fit into that? Where does Patty Mills fit into that? And then you get into the Drummonds, LMA, who's going to be coming in there? Does Nick Claxton have a role there? Is this a 7, 8-man, 9-man deep rotation when it comes to the playoffs? Be interesting to see. The other quick thing then before we get out here, we said they have Utah. Not an easy game. That's why it was critical to win the Portland one, because guess what? It's critical that they win the game against the Jazz as well. And the reason being is that when you go in and look at their schedule now, as we said before, you can talk about tough matchups and you have to win the games you feel are obviously gimmies, if you want to call them on the schedule. The heartbreaker against Dallas hurt, but now you have to win the Utah Jazz game for the simple reason that you follow them up with Memphis and with Miami on the road where Kyrie is available. And guess what? Because Kyrie is available and you'll have Kyrie and Seth Curry is back and you're going to, have as full a roster as you can have before Ben Simmons, you have to go get you'd like to get both of them. You have to get at least one of those games. You can't afford to lose those two games on the road. The specific reason being is because the soft landing spot back at home with Charlotte and Detroit are games that you won't have Kyrie in. And again, where you're going to get the best efforts, whatever you think about Charlotte in the big picture, they're still in the playing game, right? They're still there. They're still there battling with you to try to have that spot there. So, you have to find a way to get this win against Utah, to split the games on the road with Memphis and with Miami, come back home, immediately win the games against Charlotte and Detroit because you're going to get a tough one against Milwaukee, and then see how the back end of the schedule plays out. But when I looked at it, you know, the Nets have 11 games. If you're talking about getting at least 7 wins, right? 7 checkoff wins, we'd say. But if you want to have any opportunity to disrupt the 7, 8 seeding and the 6 seed, obviously, you have to win at least 8 games because you can go look at what Toronto has on tap and obviously what Cleveland has on tap. And unfortunately, to that end, we know that going back these last couple of games, things did not necessarily break the way that the Brooklyn Nets needed them to. Cleveland beat Detroit. You weren't really going to be surprised about that. Charlotte beat Dallas, the team that you just lost to. That was another difficult blow for them there. And when you go forward now, looking at the standings, at this point, I don't know if we can say anything other than you're going to have to live with these results. And we talked about how you want Toronto potentially to get up there to that 6 seed and get out of the playing game so we can go to Cleveland and have Kyrie available. It looks like the Nets are going to be in this 10 spot because as I said, if you win 8 games, 7, 8 games, you can only have Toronto go 500 the rest of the way at best to have an opportunity to get over top of them. And even then, what have you achieved? Now, I will say that still needs to be the target at the very least because we know Kyrie can't play in Toronto, but you might as well have it be that you get the home game in Brooklyn without Kyrie, but home court, right? You still want to have that opportunity, at least in that first game. And then depending on what happens, where you lose that, the 9-10, obviously with Atlanta and Charlotte, you'll see how that plays itself out. You'd still like to get up ahead of Toronto, but this is the weird world you're in. If Toronto loses and you keep winning, maybe you can get ahead of them and at least have the home game. But if Toronto can keep winning and get ahead of Cleveland, that's the ultimate goal. And they have a head-to-head matchup. They're a game and a half back right now are the Toronto Raptors of Cleveland, and they can pick up a full game in that. So if we could check that win off for them, they're a half game back, get them over the top. That's the number one option. Put yourself in a spot where you don't have to worry about not having Kyrie for the pivotal playing game. Live with that result, get into the A seed, get into the playoffs. It's just crazy. And as Doug said it on our Friday episode, the fact that we're talking about these nuanced possibilities of how things could play out, it's insane. It's absolutely insane that a Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, technically now Ben Simmons team is worried about who's going to seed where and whether or not they can get themselves out of the 8th seed. But ultimately, as it stands right now, you'd be lined up to take on the Miami Heat. That looks like with a 3-game advantage over both Philadelphia and Milwaukee. That's going to be the case. So you're going to get a sample size of what that could look like because it's a road game. It's a good opportunity, not unlike going to Philadelphia, to send a message to the Miami Heat. We may be the eighth seed, but we are not an eighth seed level team. We're far more dangerous if you didn't know. So we'll see how the game plays out on Monday night. Doug and I will be in breaking it all down in the post game, every critical game for the Brooklyn Nets. And hopefully they wrap up another win. And as we approach this critical stretch for the Brooklyn Nets, we remind you the present moment is ever the critical time. The future is merely for intelligent forethought. Robert Barr will be back again talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.